Bless you. What am I doing? Okay. Okay. I guess it really helps if I plug the projector into my computer, doesn't it? There we go. Okay. Is what I have to say. Okay, so what are we doing here? Oh, it already took the pen out. There we go. Okay, so today, obviously, we're moving on. Midterm 2 is in the books. I've only begun glancing at the answers. I haven't started marking it. Hopefully, I will do it next week. Promises, promises, promises. I will try. Every attempt at succeeding is derailed by external forces. So, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about youth and religion. And get going. I do not know why I have bookmark icons here. Thank you. That's great. Okay, much better. All right. So, how was the midterm? I want to know. Was it okay? It was good? Okay. So? I gotcha. Well, my projector has died. And are we doing this again? All right, if it does, I'm about ready to give up on today, to be honest. It's been an interesting one. Tormented by my students, told tales of murder and woe by other students. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk then, if no one has questions about the midterm or comments, and that's fine. We're going to start talking about youth and religion. And I will say, obviously, this is one of my favorite topics. This is a very, very, very condensed version of this topic. I mean, I teach a whole course on this over at St. Joe's College, which is CHRTC 309. If you're ever interested in taking a whole course about youth and religion, that goes way, way more in depth than we're going to talk about here. I've got a whole course that started out as a unit in this class, and then I broke it out and made it its own whole, 13-semester online course at St. Joe's. So, if you're interested, I do have lots more. And this is just a very, very shallow kind of preview of what you could find in other places. Okay, so it's the final exam. We'll double check. I'm pretty sure it's the 12th, but I could be wrong. I will double check. Have a good weekend. It's Wednesday. It's not time for the weekend yet. I know. I want it to be the weekend too, especially that next week is reading week. You can't say have a good weekend to me on a Wednesday. I got 2 days of this left. Probably some student watching this from Mexico. Yeah, email me. This is not a Slido-based question. Okay, yeah, email me about it. Okay, all right. What am I doing? Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. So we're going to talk religion, right? Why is religion really interesting? Well, one of the big things that particularly has become apparent really in the last 15 years is how massively the religious landscape has changed, especially when we get to our youngest generational cohorts, right? When we get to the millennials and Gen Z. And we're going to talk about them each in turn, right? They have slightly different religious profiles and slightly different religious systems, all of which we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about a couple of different pieces of research that have been done, one on the millennials, one on Gen Z, that talks about what their religious and spiritual lives look like. But the big kind of change, and the thing that's really fascinated people about both of these generational cohorts, has been really the shift in their outlook vis-a-vis religion. Okay, so this isn't, I don't have my chart here. Again, I have this in a different class, and I should have brought it in, but I forgot. But if we look at the religious composition of each of our generations, right? So all the generations we've talked about in this course are represented here, and there's weird static on my screen. I'm going to try one thing. All right, we're going to switch connections. All right, that looks better. And I'm going to make sure there's sound on the live stream because I just unplugged the microphone. Okay, happy days. Okay, we talk about our different generational cohorts, right? Very different kind of religious compositions. And you can see there's been some pretty considerable religious change from generation to generation. So what I'll note, two really, really big changes, in the composition of our generational cohorts. So if we go back to the silents, right? That's our oldest living cohort. Within a decade, they're going to be completely off the board. But the silents, you look at them, right? And so this is the United States, although Canada is a little bit different. It looks relatively like the nuns number down here is going to be a little higher in Canada. But overall, the numbers have moved in similar kinds of directions. If we go back to the silents, right, as of 2023, 48% of them identified as Protestants, right? So, a branch of Christianity. 22% of them were Catholic, or are Catholic, or silents. 7% other world religions, so Jews, Hindus, Muslims. Agnostic, atheist, I still have weird static, is 8%. And nothing in particular, a category more frequently referred to as the nuns, right? N-O-N-E-S, not the nuns, that's a different thing. The nuns, which would include atheists, agnostics, and the largest category of them being people who are just like, what's your religion? They're like, I don't know. I don't care, right? People who say nothing in particular, they just don't care. So 13%, right? And what we see pretty steadily, the percentage of Protestants has declined pretty consistently over from generation to generation. Catholics have remained roughly stable. Other world religion has grown just a little bit, but the big change is, the nothings, the nuns, nothing in particular, is now, somewhere between, a quarter and about a third of the nuns, depending on which data set you look at. General social survey numbers look a little different than this out of the US, but nothing hides that the growth of nothing in particular from generational cohort to generational cohort has been pretty considerable. Okay, so share of Americans, and again, this is my buddy Ryan Burge. I told you about him when we talked about the sex recession. He runs a Substack called Graphs About Religion, and you can find him on X or Twitter at Ryan Burge. He's fantastic. He puts out a chart or two a day, and some of the most detailed information about religion in the US that you can find. And this data he took from the Pew National Opinion Reference Survey, data from 2020 to 2023, and basically, kind of catalogs the share of Americans with no religious affiliation based on this survey. What we see is overall for Americans, it's somewhere, around 30% of all Americans today, like as total of the population, who report having no religion. And this has been increasing over time. It really started to pick up in the late 1990s and in the 2000s. And now it looks like it's decelerating a little bit and maybe even reversing somewhat. But this has been a huge seismic change in the religious landscape of the United States. Canada looks very similar in this respect as well. Oopsie. Okay. So, share, and you can see this chart, share who have no religious affiliation by birth year. So basically, we see roughly kind of flat to slightly upward religious trajectories for people born 1980 to about 2005, right? So still pretty high, right? We see, those born, from the 1980s to 2005, still below half the population, but, there's been a kind of somewhat steady rise, and it depends on, which wave of the data you look at. If you're looking at this most recent one, right, people born in 1980, a little bit less religious, slightly more religious, those born in 1990, and then those born in 2005 are probably the most irreligious of all, based on this CES kind of data. Okay, but you see the change over time, right? And this is the chart that really shows it. If we go back, in the General Social Survey to the first wave of the GSS in 1972, about 5% of Americans said that they had no religion, right? By the time we get to this 2020 wave, that number's up to almost a third. So this has been a, hugely growing kind of trend, and it's one of the biggest stories in, I think it's undersold. Again, I'm a source of religion nerd. I love source of religion. So I'm likely to say that this particular topic does not get enough attention. Why? Because I love it and I think it's super interesting. But it's probably one of the most dramatic shifts in kind of ideology, religious adherence that we've ever seen, and that we have real data to track, right? There may have been shifts like this in the past, but we weren't tracking it as carefully as what we're seeing now. And what we see, right, is irreligion growing massively, especially amongst younger people, but overall in the population as well. So the rise of the nuns, right, is one of the biggest and most interesting sociology story of the last 15 to 20 years, right? And it really is, a fundamental transformation of the religious landscape, in a relatively short period. Okay, so these are slightly ugly graphs. But if you want to talk, what does Gen Z look like, right, in terms of their religious composition from a slightly different kind of data set? So these are all charts, and these are taken from, now that I think of it, they probably are putting out their latest report soon. So this comes from a research institute out of Colorado called Springtide Research Institute. I'm just going to put RI for Research Institute because I'm too lazy to write it. And they started in about 2018 running this annual survey of young people ages 13 through 25, right? Now, as they've moved forward, right, and these are the most kind of recent waves, 2021, 2023, and 2024, where they put out these fun infographics. As they've gone forward in these studies, their sample sizes have gotten bigger and bigger. When they were down here, they were doing about 3,000. Or maybe it was about 1,500. Sorry, the first wave here was about 1,500. By the time they're over here, I think they're doing about 12,000 surveys. So they've increased kind of their scope. But what's really interesting about this, it's just sort of looking at the religious composition of Gen Z, right? Because they've tracked it kind of year on year. And so we see, some stability and some change in this relatively short period. Okay, so what's notable? They've got this category, which most other places don't, and I really think most places should adopt it, which is just Christian. Why is that a kind of important category? We'll talk about it as we go on later, But Gen Z, in terms of their religious lives, we can categorize them as highly deinstitutionalized. So, amongst one of the biggest and I think most underappreciated changes in sort of American and Canadian religious life and religious identification, oops, sorry, I know how to write, is that this term, right, Protestant, right? So one of the major branches of Christianity, right? We just passed another anniversary of sort of the beginning of Protestantism, because the Protestant Reformation begins October 31st, 1517, when Martin Luther, nails his 95 treaties to the cathedral door in Wittenberg, and sort of, ends up starting a process which we come to call the Protestant Reformation that leads to the establishment of a whole bunch of other churches other than the Roman Catholic Church in the West. But this term, Protestant, right, for a long time was understood as one of the major kind of branches of Christianity. But our youngest generation, right, our Gen Z, largely now no longer understands what Protestant is. So there's this whole new and interesting category of just Christian, right, who are for the most part, a couple of things. They're either evangelicals. Now, evangelicals are Protestants, right? You would have called them in the past evangelical Protestants, like a branch of Protestantism, or in some cases, a sub-branch of evangelical Protestantism, Pentecostals. Which again, if you want to go deeper on religion, these are very interesting kind of categories. The interesting thing, though, is a lot of people who belong to these traditions would no longer identify as Protestant. They're increasingly likely to say that they are just Christian. And the kind of churches that they belong to are largely, churches that are sort of not part of larger institutional groupings, right? So you might be going to, let me see if I could think of an example, right? So there's really famous examples, like out of Australia. You might have heard like the documentary, right, about Hillsong Church. Or there's other places like Elevation Church in Redding, California. They're what you would call mega churches, right? Most of those churches, right, often who have like thousands or tens of thousands of members, are just kind of these standalone bodies, right? They don't belong to a larger tradition. They're not Catholic, they're not Lutheran, they're not Presbyterian, they're not Baptist. They're just sort of whatever they are, right? They exist on their own. And a lot of those people, will call, if you ask them on a survey, they will call themselves just Christian, right? Okay. Now, this ends up being an important distinction because sometimes what has happened is when you have, the choices on a survey, I know how to write Protestant, I swear. Protestant or nothing in particular. I'm just going to put nothing in particular. People who are evangelical and don't know what Protestant means, they will pick nothing in particular instead, right? So in including, I'm getting down into like the nitty-gritty of the survey, how to compose a survey if you want to find out about religion. If you want to find out really about the religious landscape in a country like the US, including just Christian, ends up being a really important category because all those people who are evangelicals who don't think of themselves as Protestant and don't actually know what Protestant means, they will choose just Christian over nothing in particular in this case. So I like these Springtide numbers because they look a little different than, say, the GSS numbers, and in particular that, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular number looks a little smaller. And I think largely it goes down to, people identifying with this category. So what does it kind of look like, right? So if we look at, I really should have done the math beforehand. My brain's a little shot, right? So if we look at kind of Christianity, in all three of these kind of yearly surveys, right? What do we see? We see Christianity just kind of a little bit over the 50% margin amongst Gen Z, right? the numbers vary a little bit, right? But Christians, and here, right, they get really confusing because agnostic in this sample was 12%, so it's bigger than the people who consider themselves Protestant. So it kind of splits the Christian part. But again, you end up with, 37 plus 18, right? So that is like 55% or so. I can't do math. I just heard a very traumatic backstory from a student. So no worries. But it's a little bit more than 50%, right? And it's pretty consistent if you take the three main Christian categories, just Christian, Catholic, and Protestant together, right? So, yeah, it's 27, yeah, just over 50%. So, so these numbers look a little bit different than the GSS. And specifically, if you look at all of these, right, you have, in our non-religious categories, atheists being 8, you add nothing in particular, you've got 16, and if you add, one more category here, agnostic, you've got 24. And those categories, they wobble around a little bit from generational cohort to generational cohort, or sorry, from year to year, rather. But, you end up with a pretty nearly consistent number, right? Here it's, 27, and here it is 12 and 21 and 27, right? Again, so generally speaking, you're talking about, a little bit over 50%, 55-ish that call themselves Christian. I guess it's a little bit more than that if you throw in Orthodox. Where's my orthos? 2, right? So you're in the really high 50s, and about a little bit more than a quarter of the sample that says they are atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. So this is a really interesting look year by year at Gen Z. We see some variations, but also a lot of consistency across this sample. Okay. I want to go to a question slide. I actually have no. Why did I decide not to give you more time? Because? Would it be cruel to say I forgot? No. I just thought 90 minutes was probably enough. I didn't want to stress people out by making it 2 hours. Maybe that would have stressed out people less. I don't know. Again, I didn't want people to have to spend their whole day on it. Saying that there's been a rise in Gen Z and millennials that are going to church. Why do I think that is? Okay, hang on. I'm going to go back for a second, and then I'm going to write the word Pentecostals. Right? Okay, that's the other word after evangelicals. Okay, so, let's go back. That is what, hang on, clear this. There's been a lot of recent articles saying there's been a rise in Gen Z and millennials that are going to church. Why do I think that is? Okay, so I'm going to give you my for reals answer. Most of that evidence is entirely anecdotal, right? There's a little bit of evidence out of the UK suggesting, what they're calling in the UK the quiet revival. I have that data. I can't remember what it is. I could probably pull it up if need be. Suggesting that, right, the percentage of millennials and especially Gen Z that have kind of returned to church in the UK is quite substantial. Now, that said, that is a 2 survey data point done by a motivated organization. So I think there are reasons to be skeptical about this data. It's potentially the sign of something, but I think we need a better data set out of the UK than the one that's been pointed to, because it was done by, I think, the British Bible Association ran this survey, and I'm not saying they're biased. They might be biased, right? Because maybe they want it to be true. It could be happening. I think we need better data. And I'm gonna stick with my buddy Ryan on this one, because he's been deep diving on this kind of on this narrative that's going on about a quiet revival or a religious revival in the United States. And what I will say is, so far, and this may change, right? I'm open to changing my mind on this. There is no empirical evidence of a revival happening in the US. There's a lot of anecdotes. A lot of them are, wow, my really traditional church is full of millennials and Gen Z. Lots of young men are converting to Catholicism in particular, or Eastern Orthodoxy. And again, these may be true. I have no idea. I'm not in those communities on a regular basis. I don't know. I haven't seen, any of the anecdotes to say if they're true. Based on merely, the statistics, there's no evidence so far of any kind of religious revival amongst Gen Z or millennials, right? It could, now the most recent wave of the data that we have is the 2024 GSS, right? So the General Social Survey they literally just tranched out their religion stuff 2 days ago. And Ryan has been digging into it, and I've been reading his stuff with great fervor and interest. And, what do we see? Well, pretty much exactly what you'd think. Gen Z is the least likely to be attending religious services weekly or monthly. Millennials are the second least likely to be attending weekly or monthly. And so far, and it's been pretty consistent, right? It's following the same trend line as it was prior to that 2024 wave. We're seeing a little bit of a reversal in the nothing in particular number. And again, you here for more details on this, come take social religion with me or something at St. Joe's. I've got it in all my St. Joe's classes except Catholicism and pop culture. But empirical evidence, I've yet to see. And trust me, if it was there, I would tell you, because I would think it was super exciting and super interesting. I do think we're seeing a little bit of a reversal in the nuns. We see a little bit of a drop in millennials in particular, identifying as nothing in particular. That may be auguring some kind of bigger change to come in the future. But so far, we're not seeing a big return to religion in the data. Now, the data always lags a little bit, right? Probably the place that we'd see it, and this isn't going to help anyone, would be the 2026 General Social Survey, and we won't get that data until 2027. So by then, most of you will have graduated, and you'll be, probably driving your Ferraris that you earn with the fabulous jobs that you get, or living in a tiny apartment somewhere. I don't know which, either way. But so far, it's a really good question, and I kind of, I know this narrative's going around. I don't see objective evidence for it, only anecdotes. Okay, sorry, that was a long answer, but it's a really interesting question. All right, so what am I going to talk about now? So I want to talk about, and we're going to split this into a kind of two sections. We're going to talk about the millennials. As always, the millennials, right? And just to remind you, this is our generation born 1980 to roughly 1994, 1995-ish, right? So this is the generational cohort. So for data on the religious lives of millennials, we are going to turn to one of my very favorite studies of all time. Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand. I'm ignoring you. Do you have an anecdote? Dang. No, I think I understand what you're saying. So, that's definitely possible. And one of the quirks in the more recent data is okay, let me just make sure I say this correctly. In kind of more recent data, one of the really strange quirks that we're seeing, and this is relatively unique, is men seem to have kind of turned a corner and become more religious than women. right? Especially in those youngest 2 generational cohorts, right? Now, traditionally, like through all of the social science we have, women were more religious than men. They attended religious services more often. They expressed higher levels of belief. I would characterize the data on kind of our more recent data on the youngest 2 cohorts as incredibly mixed, right? There's slightly higher attendance rates for young men, but if you look at some of the other indicators of religiosity, like daily prayer, scripture reading, belonging, particular beliefs, that data is a lot more mixed, right? It's kind of a mess. Like some is high, some is low, some is all over the place. So there's not a consistent pattern. In some ways, women still look more religious than men. In other ways, men are starting to like outpace women in terms of their religiosity. So in terms of the question, are people maybe, is it like, young men who are like, say, sick of feminism and are trying to bless their anti-feminist ideology with, say, religious backing? Maybe. It's really, really hard to say without doing a whole bunch of qualitative research. Do you have a rich uncle who would like to fund a bunch of qualitative research? Dang it. So, if anyone has a rich uncle that would like to fund a bunch of religious research, come talk to me after class. More than happy to oblige. We're seeing shifts. We don't really know why, right? We don't know what's behind it. Some people have speculated as like, some of the problems that I've talked about in class with young men struggling. And as they've struggled, people have suggested they're rejecting modernity, right? They're like, this modernity thing doesn't work. And so they're turning back to older sources of wisdom, or older traditions of kind of human life. Some turning to Islam, some turning to, traditional forms of Christianity, particularly Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Again, none of that appears in the data, right? People talk all the time like, man, there's young men flooding into Eastern Orthodox churches. Eastern Orthodox churches shrunk in the most recent wave of the congressional election survey. They're smaller than they were 5 years ago. And so, there's no objective data to sort of back that up. There's just anecdotes. Yeah, please. It could be. It's coming mostly out of the U.S. and the U.S. like Orthodox kind of community. Some of it's Slavic, some of it's Greek, right? It's quite diverse. I think, some of it might be wishful thinking. And I would tend to put it down to some, a few, like 5, these are small communities to start with, and 5 more men showed up. And that seems like a lot, right? And then maybe 2 more, a year later, and 2 more, and they're interpreting that as a like cultural shift. And then they go post it on Twitter, and this narrative sort of picks up speed on Twitter or other social media, right? And again, I think it would be really cool if that was the case, because it would be something else to talk about in sociology of religion. I just don't see it in the data, right? So is it Russian propaganda? Maybe, but Catholics are doing it too, right? Catholics are, especially the Latin Mass crowd, like it's like, the thing that went wrong in Catholicism was when we stopped using Latin. Sure. Not the sex abuse. It was the lack of Latin. I say that as a Catholic, right? It wasn't the sex abuse. It was we stopped using Latin. That's what caused everyone to leave. There's a lot in those traditional communities as well. And again, I think there's a lot of anecdotal thinking. I think, people who are looking for more traditional forms find those forms, and then they're like, oh my God, there are so many young people seeking religion, and they just kind of, like people who make this case. There's one in Edmonton. He's a blogger and podcaster in Edmonton. His name is Brian Holdsworth. And I've constantly sent him messages on his X and YouTube page, because he's always like, yeah, people are flooding to the Latin Mass. And I'm like, please, show me data. Like, come, talk to me. Like, we'll have a conversation in Edmonton. I'll buy you a coffee and show me the data. And he never responds, right? And I've tried sending him emails too. He just doesn't respond. I don't know, maybe he thinks I'm a Marxist, godless sociologist. And maybe that's fair. I don't know anymore. But, they never have any data to back it up. It's all like, well, I've noticed. Okay, well, that and $5 will get you $5, if you will. Sorry, did I answer your question? Yeah, okay. Great. These are good questions. All right, where was I? I don't know. Time has no meaning. I realized I planned very poorly in having only 2 classes before reading week, because I can't present this whole unit in 2 classes, but also there's going to be a huge gap, probably in the middle of one slide, starting on Friday. So whatever. Okay. National Study of Youth and Religion, as I was talking about. It's this big project that ran out of University of Notre Dame, led by my favorite living sociologist of religion, Christian Smith. And I make that distinction only because Rodney Stark is now dead, and I loved him. He was my favorite. I was a fan. He is the honey badger of sociology of religion, and that has always made me happy. But Christian Smith is a close second, really great sociologist, and he ran this big project out of University of Notre Dame that basically followed a group of young people from the early 2000s until the mid-2010s, cataloging their religious lives, right? So the first wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion, grabbed people when they were 13 to 18, and then they followed them for 15 years, right? Bless you. At 5-year increments, right? So that every 5 years, they've tried to find as many of them, resurveyed them, and re-interviewed them, right? So they did this great big research project. The first wave is probably the most interesting one, the one that they did in 2001, when these young people were teenagers, right? From which they put out a book called Soul Searching, the Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers. Really, really interesting book. Has a lot of interesting stuff, some of which I will talk about. And in the book, one of the things they argued was that, American religion was funny and not exactly what you think. That what they saw in America was that most of the young people, even those who identified as Christian, were not really Christian in the traditional sense. They were something that Smith and his co-author, Melissa Lundquist Denton, called moralistic therapeutic deists, right? And that they adhered to an idea called moralistic therapeutic deism, though not any of them would have used that term right off the bat. Okay, so what is moralistic therapeutic deism? So I'm going to play a video, and then I'm going to talk about it. Today's a good day for a video.
The majority of America.
Of course, the sound on my laptop isn't working, because it never works that well. Oh, right. I always forget. I have to switch HDMI here. Okay, maybe it'll work now.
Teenagers, I think, are moralistic therapeutic deists, not Catholic, not therapeutic.
I'll try that again. I'm going to raise the volume so you can hear it.
The majority of American teenagers, I think, are moralistic therapeutic deists, not Catholic, not Presbyterian, not Jewish. The God of moralistic therapeutic deism, I say in the book, is something like a combination of a divine butler and cosmic therapist. He takes care of your problems, he helps you to work out your difficulties, and doesn't get too personally involved in the meanwhile. Perfect. Moralistic therapeutic deism basically believes, sure, a God exists, it's theistic, God created the world, God orders the world morally, people should be nice and fair and friendly, that the purpose of life is to be happy, to be satisfied, that's what it's really about, that God doesn't need to be very involved in one's life. God can sort of be off at a distance, hence the deism, except when one gets into trouble or has problems or needs something solved, then one can call on God and God will sort of hop to it. And teens have an immense amount of faith that God solves their problems. He fixes their troubles and he makes life work better. He makes them happier. Religious traditions are, from my perspective, are really being colonized and corroded from the inside out by moralistic therapeutic deism. And that is, as a sociologist, I am skeptical of what is going to be the fiber or the theological content or the intellectual substance of beliefs and practices of people a generation hence. It seems to me that many social forces are basically converging to sort of water down religious faith of all different sorts, so that you no longer have distinctively Catholic and Jewish and Muslim and Wesleyan or whatever. You just have this sort of bland mush of be nice, call on God when you need him. And that is not what these religious traditions really believe. I've come to think that, our culture increasingly, the language of faith is like a second language. It's like Spanish or French or German. It's not a primary language that people learn and speak. And we know about second languages that, you don't just pick it up by osmosis. You need to be around people that speak it. You need to be instructed in it. You need to have practice talking in it. And I think one of the things that was clear in what we found is that very few adolescents are having much practice learning to speak their second language of faith.
Okay, so, love Chris. Okay, so the creed, if you want, or greed, I almost wrote greed, the creed of moralistic therapeutic deism, right? Or its list of primary beliefs. Number one, so MTD, so millennials, for the most part, still believe a God exists and that God, sort of was involved in the creation of the world or the universe, or however you want to phrase it, and watches over human life on Earth. What does God want? Well, God wants people to be nice and good and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible, and I will highlight this part because it's important. And by most world religions, right? So it is what you would call syncretistic, right? So it basically reduces all religions to, basically a similar set of beliefs, right? It says all religions basically believe the same things and typically is quite willing to mix and match religious beliefs as suits the individuals. So it's syncretistic. What is the goal of life? Well, the goal of life, it's not to serve God or do good, or whatever. It is to be happy and feel good about yourself, right? So if you wanted to, the T in moralistic therapeutic deism, which I'll talk about more probably next class, is therapeutic, right? So it's very therapeutic, right? This God that millennials believe in is mostly just kind of there. You ring up the old God phone when something goes bad in your life and you need God, but otherwise, you don't really need God, and God is not particularly involved in anything. And the fifth one, good people go to heaven when they die. And this is always one that I find quite amusing, because this term good people is incredibly inclusive. And when you read the books that come out of National Study of Youth and Religion, one of the things you realize is that almost everybody is a good person, right? So it's like they ask, well, are you a good person? And it's like, well, I haven't killed anybody. So yes, that feels like a pretty low bar for being a good person, right? You're not Hitler. So that also, puts you in the category of good person. And my favorite one, there's this one character that they come back to in all three waves of the survey. His name is John. And I would describe John in my own terms as probably not that good of a person, right? He's misogynistic. He uses women. He's fathered children who he's abandoned. He is fought with his father, taking his father on a road trip to Vegas and gotten into a fist fight with his father, but still says he's basically a good person, which I always find, mildly amusing, because, I think by any reasonable standard, one could question John's goodness, but there you have it. I have no question slides. Social media and being able to access all this new information about church and different religions is playing a factor in the new data. That's a really interesting question. I'm going to think about that until next class, because I want to talk about one more thing here. I feel like these anecdotes are because of social media and the rise of Christian influencers. I think you've got it there. Okay, so am I back to my slide? I'm going to talk about this, and then we'll go after this. So one of the things that we should be clear about is nobody actually uses the term moralistic therapeutic deism to talk about themselves, right? It is a term that Smith and Denton put together as a kind of aggregate for what they see as the actual belief system of teenagers, not a term that teenagers actually used. So I'm going to put this in a couple of terms. I'm going to break down the three aspects of MTD, first with the moralistic, right? So the M in moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD is moralistic, right? So what is it to be moralistic, right? It's to have a sort of set out moral code that people are expected to adhere to. If they do, they're a good person. If they don't, they are a bad person. So what does the belief system of MTD suggest? So central to living a good life, right? Again, as the creed kind of shows, I'll highlight here, is being a good moral person, right? So the goal is live a good and happy life, and you do that by being a good person. What does being a good person mean? Well, it means being nice, pleasant, respectful, and responsible. I love this one. I'm going to highlight it in a different color because I think it's, its own interesting thing. Working on self-improvement, right? So again, you see that boomer ideology, right? The self-help, the self-discovery, that ideology that they very much inculcated first into Gen X and then the millennials, coming up in the religious beliefs of the millennials, right? You should be working on self-improvement, right? To make yourself better. It's a very capitalistic notion to my mind, and it's a very self-helpy boomer notion. Taking care of your health, right? Now again, some religious systems will stress, like Sikhism in particular, will stress taking care of your health as an important religious precept. But, it is an interesting one to find in there. It's also a very, I think, kind of neoliberal capitalist one, right? That taking care of your health is important, right? And part of being a moral person is taking care of your health and working on self-improvement. Those aren't just good things for people to do, but that's what makes you a good person. Okay. And key in this, I'm going to highlight in one last color here. Which one's likely to be visible? Orange. Being a moral in this faith means being the kind of person other people will like. So you need to be likable, right? You need to fulfill your personal potential. Again, there's that capitalist kind of Protestant ethic-y, very Weberian language that you might think, right? You need to fulfill your personal potential. Being lazy and not achieving your potential would be bad. And then, not being socially disruptive or interpersonally obnoxious. This is a polite way for Smith and Denton to say what people actually told them it meant to be a good person, which is, and I quote from the book, people told them, "Don't be an asshole," and that was, part of being a good person was not being an asshole. And I think very importantly, and I'll close with this point. I don't know if I can highlight in red and you can still see it. This moral vision, right, would be inclusive of most religions, right? So, which most of the kind of millennials will treat as roughly the same, right? And a very common metaphor that people will use is that Catholicism, Protestantism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, right? All of these religions are simply different paths up the same mountain, right? So religions are really all equivalent. They all believe the same things. There's just different articulations. Okay. And feeling good about yourself is an essential aspect of living a good moral life, which on Friday will take us into the second part of this definition, which is the therapeutic aspect. But we'll leave that for Friday. And I will answer these very challenging and very interesting questions. Okay, see you on Friday.